Persia. 1. The rise and fall of the Medes. Their origins, rulers, the blood treaty of Sardis, degeneration. Who were the Medes that had played so vital a role in the destruction of Assyria? Their origin, of course, eludes us. History is a book that one must begin in the middle. The first mention we have of them is on a tablet recording the expedition of Shalmaneser III into a country called Parsua, in the mountains of Kurdistan, 837 B.C. There, it seems, 27 chieftain kings ruled over 27 states thinly populated by a people called Amadai, Madai, Medes. As Indo-Europeans, they had probably come into Western Asia about 1,000 years before Christ, from the shores of the Caspian Sea. The Zend-Avesta, sacred scriptures of the Persians, idealized the racial memory of this ancient homeland and described it as a paradise. The scenes of our youth, like the past, are always beautiful, if we do not have to live in them again. The Medes appear to have wandered through the region of Bokhara and Samarkand, and to have migrated farther and farther south, at last reaching Persia. They found copper, iron, lead, gold, and silver, marble and precious stones in the mountains in which they made their new home, and being a simple and vigorous people, they developed a prosperous agriculture on the plains and the slopes of the hills. At Ecbatana, that is a meeting place of many ways, in a picturesque valley made fertile by the melting snows of the highlands, their first king, Dioces, founded their first capital, adorning and dominating it with a royal palace spread over an area 2/3 of a mile square. According to an uncorroborated passage in Herodotus, Dioces achieved power by acquiring a reputation for justice, and having achieved power became a despot. He issued regulations that no man should be admitted to the king's presence, but everyone should consult him by means of messengers, and moreover that it should be accounted indecency for anyone to laugh or spit before him. He established such ceremony about his person for this reason, that he might appear to be of a different nature to them who did not see him. Under his leadership, the Medes, strengthened by their natural and frugal life, and hardened by custom and environment to the necessities of war, became a threat to the power of Assyria, which repeatedly invaded Media, thought it most instructively defeated, and found it in fact never tired of fighting for its liberty. The greatest of the Median kings, Cyaxares, settled the matter by destroying Nineveh. Inspired by this victory, his army swept through western Asia to the very gates of Sardis, only to be turned back by an eclipse of the sun. The opposing leaders, frightened by this apparent warning from the skies, signed a treaty of peace and sealed it by drinking each other's blood. In the next year Cyaxares died, having in the course of one reign expanded his kingdom from a subject province into an empire embracing Assyria, Media, and Persia. Within a generation after his death, this empire came to an end. Its tenure was too brief to permit of any substantial contribution to civilization, except insofar as it prepared for the culture of Persia. To Persia the Medes gave their Aryan language, their alphabet of 36 characters, their replacement of clay with parchment and pen as writing materials, their extensive use of the column in architecture, their moral code of conscientious husbandry in time of peace and limitless bravery in time of war, their Zoroastrian religion of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, their patriarchal family and polygamous marriage, and a body of law sufficiently like that of the later empire to be united with it in the famous phrase of Daniel about the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Of their literature and their art not a stone or a letter remains. Their degeneration was even more rapid than their rise. Astyages, who succeeded his father Cyaxares, proved again that monarchy is a gamble in whose royal succession great wits and madness are near allied. He inherited the kingdom with equanimity and settled down to enjoy it. Under his example, the nation forgot its stern morals and stoic ways. Wealth had come too suddenly to be wisely used. The upper classes became the slaves of fashion and luxury, the men wore embroidered trousers, the women covered themselves with cosmetics and jewelry, the very horses were often caparisoned in gold. These once simple and pastoral people, who had been glad to be carried in rude wagons with wheels cut roughly out of the trunks of trees, now rode in expensive chariots from feast to feast. The early kings had prided themselves on justice, but Astyages, being displeased with Harpagus, served up to him the dismembered and headless body of his own son and forced him to eat of it. Harpagus ate, saying that whatever a king did was agreeable to him, but he revenged himself by helping Cyrus to depose Astyages. When Cyrus, the brilliant young ruler of the Median dependency of Anshan in Persia, rebelled against the effeminate despot of Ecbatana, the Medes themselves welcomed Cyrus's victory and accepted him almost without protest as their king. By one engagement, Media ceased to be the master of Persia, Persia became the master of Media, and prepared to become the master of the whole Near Eastern world. 2. The Great Kings. The romantic Cyrus, his enlightened policies, Cambyses, Darius the Great, the invasion of Greece. Cyrus was one of those natural rulers at whose coronation, as Emerson said, all men rejoice. Royal in spirit and action, capable of wise administration as well as of dramatic conquest, generous to the defeated and loved by those who had been his enemies, no wonder the Greeks made him the subject of innumerable romances and, to their minds, the greatest hero before Alexander. It is a disappointment to us that we cannot draw a reliable picture of him from either Herodotus or Xenophon. The former has mingled many fables with his history, while the other has made the Cyropedia, an essay on the military art, with incidental lectures on education and philosophy. At times Xenophon confuses Cyrus and Socrates. These delightful stories being put aside, the figure of Cyrus becomes merely an attractive ghost. We can only say that he was handsome, since the Persians made him their model of physical beauty to the end of their ancient art, that he established the Achaemenid dynasty of great kings, which ruled Persia through the most famous period of its history, that he organized the soldiery of Media and Persia into an invincible army, captured Sardis and Babylon, ended for 1,000 years the rule of the Semites in Western Asia, and absorbed the former realms of Assyria, Babylonia, Lydia, and Asia Minor into the Persian Empire, the largest political organization of pre-Roman antiquity, and one of the best governed in history. So far as we can visualize him through the haze of legend, he was the most amiable of conquerors and founded his empire upon generosity. His enemies knew that he was lenient, and they did not fight him with that desperate courage which men show when their only choice is to kill or die. We have seen how, according to Herodotus, he rescued Croesus from the funeral pyre at Sardis and made him one of his most honored counselors. We have seen how magnanimously he treated the Jews. The first principle of his policy was that the various peoples of his empire should be left free in their religious worship and beliefs, for he fully understood the first principle of statesmanship, that religion is stronger than the state. Instead of sacking cities and wrecking temples, he showed a courteous respect for the deities of the conquered and contributed to maintaining their shrines. Even the Babylonians, who had resisted him so long, warmed towards him when they found him preserving their sanctuaries and honoring their pantheon. Wherever he went in his unprecedented career, he offered pious sacrifice to the local divinities. Like Napoleon, he accepted indifferently all religions and, with much better grace, humored all the gods. Like Napoleon, too, he died of excessive ambition. Having won all the Near East, he began a series of campaigns aimed to free Media and Persia from the inroads of Central Asia's nomadic barbarians. He seems to have carried these excursions as far as the Jaxartes on the north and India on the east. Suddenly, at the height of his curve, he was slain in battle with the Massigitai, an obscure tribe that peopled the southern shores of the Caspian Sea. Like Alexander, he conquered an empire but did not live to organize it. One great defect had sullied his character, occasional and incalculable cruelty. It was inherited, unmixed with Cyrus's generosity, by his half-mad son. Cambyses began by putting to death his brother and rival, Smerdis. Then, lured by the accumulated wealth of Egypt, he set forth to extend the Persian Empire to the Nile. He succeeded, but apparently at the cost of his sanity. Memphis was captured easily, but an army of 50,000 Persians sent to annex the oasis of Ammon perished in the desert, and an expedition to Carthage failed because the Phoenician crews of the Persian fleet refused to attack a Phoenician colony. Cambyses lost his head and abandoned the wise clemency and tolerance of his father. He publicly scoffed at the Egyptian religion and plunged his dagger derisively into the bull revered by the Egyptians as the god Apis. He exhumed mummies and pried into royal tombs regardless of ancient curses. He profaned the temples and ordered their idols to be burned. He thought in this way to cure the Egyptians of superstition, but when he was stricken with illness, apparently epileptic convulsions, the Egyptians were certain that their gods had punished him, and that their theology was now confirmed beyond dispute. As if again to illustrate the inconveniences of monarchy, Cambyses, with a Napoleonic kick in the stomach, killed his sister and wife Roxana, slew his son Prexaspes with an arrow, buried 12 noble Persians alive, condemned Croesus to death, repented, rejoiced to learn that the sentence had not been carried out, and punished the officers who had delayed in executing it. On his way back to Persia, he learned that a usurper had seized the throne and was being supported by widespread revolution. From that moment he disappears from history. Tradition has it that he killed himself. The usurper had pretended to be Smerdis, miraculously preserved from Cambyses's fratricidal jealousy. In reality, he was a religious fanatic, a devotee of the early Magian faith who was bent upon destroying Zoroastrianism, the official religion of the Persian state. Another revolution soon deposed him, and the 7 aristocrats who had organized it raised one of their number, Darius, son of Hystaspes, to the throne. In this bloody way began the reign of Persia's greatest king. Succession to the throne in Oriental monarchies was marked not only by palace revolutions in strife for the royal power, but by uprisings in subject colonies that grasped the chance of chaos or an inexperienced ruler to reclaim their liberty. The usurpation and assassination of Smerdis gave to Persia's vassals an excellent opportunity. The governors of Egypt and Lydia refused submission, and the provinces of Susiana, Babylonia, Media, Assyria, Armenia, Sacia, and others rose in simultaneous revolt. Darius subdued them with a ruthless hand. Taking Babylon after a long siege, he crucified 3,000 of its leading citizens as an inducement to obedience in the rest, and in a series of swift campaigns he pacified one after another of the rebellious states. Then, perceiving how easily the vast empire might in any crisis fall to pieces, he put off the armor of war, became one of the wisest administrators in history, and set himself to re-establish his realm in a way that became a model of imperial organization till the fall of Rome. His rule gave Western Asia a generation of such order and prosperity as that quarrelsome region had never before known. He had hoped to govern in peace, but it is the fatality of empire to breed repeated war. For the conquered must be periodically reconquered, and the conquerors must keep the arts and habits of camp and battlefield. At any moment the kaleidoscope of change may throw up a new empire to challenge the old. In such a situation, wars must be invented if they do not arise of their own accord. Each generation must be inured to the rigors of campaigns, and taught by practice the sweet decorum of dying for one's country. Perhaps it was in part for this reason that Darius led his armies into southern Russia, across the Bosporus and the Danube to the Volga, to chastise the marauding Scythians, and again across Afghanistan and 100 mountain ranges into the valley of the Indus, adding thereby extensive regions and millions of souls and rupees to his realm. More substantial reasons must be sought for his expedition into Greece. Herodotus would have us believe that Darius entered upon this historic faux pas because one of his wives, Atassa, teased him into it in bed. But it is more dignified to believe that the king recognized in the Greek city-states and their colonies a potential empire, or an actual confederacy, dangerous to the Persian mastery of Western Asia. When Ionia revolted and received aid from Sparta and Athens, Darius reconciled himself reluctantly to war. All the world knows the story of his passage across the Aegean, the defeat of his army at Marathon, and his gloomy return to Persia. There, amid far-flung preparations for another attempt upon Greece, he suddenly grew weak and died. 3. Persian life and industry. The empire, the people, the language, the peasants, the imperial highways, trade and finance. At its greatest extent, under Darius, the Persian Empire included 20 provinces or satrapies, embracing Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Phoenicia, Lydia, Phrygia, Ionia, Cappadocia, Cilicia, Armenia, Assyria, the Caucasus, Babylonia, Media, Persia, the modern Afghanistan and Baluchistan, India west of the Indus, Sogdiana, Bactria, and the regions of the Masagitai and other Central Asiatic tribes. Never before had history recorded so extensive an area brought under one government. Persia itself, which was to rule these 40 million souls for 200 years, was not at that time the country now known to us as Persia, and to its inhabitants as Iran. It was that smaller tract immediately east of the Persian Gulf, known to the ancient Persians as Pars, and to the modern Persians as Fars or Farsistan. Composed almost entirely of mountains and deserts, poor in rivers, subject to severe winters and hot, arid summers, it could support its 2 million inhabitants only through such external contributions as trade or conquest might bring. Its race of hardy mountaineers came like the Medes of Indo-European stock, perhaps from South Russia, and its language and early religion reveal its close kinship with those Aryans who crossed Afghanistan to become the ruling caste of northern India. Darius I, in an inscription at Naksh-i-Rustam, described himself as a Persian, the son of a Persian, an Aryan of Aryan descent. The Zoroastrians spoke of their primitive land as Aryana Vaijo, the Aryan home. Strabo applied the name Aryana to what is now called by essentially the same word, Iran. The Persians were apparently the handsomest people of the ancient Near East. The monuments picture them as erect and vigorous, made hardy by their mountains and yet refined by their wealth, with a pleasing symmetry of features, an almost Greek straightness of nose, and a certain nobility of countenance and carriage. They adopted for the most part the Median dress and later the Median ornaments. They considered it indecent to reveal more than the face. Clothing covered them from turban, fillet, or cap to sandals or leather shoes. Triple drawers, a white undergarment of linen, a double tunic with sleeves hiding the hands, and a girdle at the waist kept the population warm in winter and hot in summer. The king distinguished himself with embroidered trousers of a crimson hue and saffron-buttoned shoes. The dress of the women differed from that of the men only in a slit at the breast. The men wore long beards and hung their hair in dark curls, or, later, covered it with wigs. In the wealthier days of the empire, men as well as women made much use of cosmetics. Creams were employed to improve the complexion, and coloring matter was applied to the eyelids to increase the apparent size and brilliance of the eyes. A special class of adorners, called kosmetai by the Greeks, arose as beauty experts to the aristocracy. The Persians were connoisseurs in scents and were believed by the ancients to have invented cosmetic creams. The king never went to war without a case of costly unguents to ensure his fragrance in victory or defeat. Many languages have been used in the long history of Persia. The speech of the court and the nobility in the days of Darius I was Old Persian, so closely related to Sanskrit that evidently both were once dialects of an older tongue and were cousins to our own. Old Persian developed on the one hand into Zend, the language of the Zend-Avesta, and on the other hand into Pahlavi, a Hindu tongue from which has come the Persian language of today. When the Persians took to writing, they adopted the Babylonian cuneiform for their inscriptions and the Aramaic alphabetic script for their documents. They simplified the unwieldy syllabary of the Babylonians from 300 characters to 36 signs, which gradually became letters instead of syllables and constituted a cuneiform alphabet. Writing, however, seemed to the Persians an effeminate amusement, for which they could spare little time from love, war, and the chase. They did not condescend to produce literature. The common man was contentedly illiterate and gave himself completely to the culture of the soil. The Zend-Avesta exalted agriculture as the basic and noblest occupation of mankind, pleasing above all other labors to Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. Some of the land was tilled by peasant proprietors who occasionally joined several families in agricultural cooperatives to work extensive areas together. Part of the land was owned by feudal barons and cultivated by tenants in return for a share of the crop. Part of it was tilled by foreign, never Persian, slaves. Oxen pulled a plow of wood armed with a metal point. Artificial irrigation drew water from the mountains to the fields. Barley and wheat were the staple crops and foods, but much meat was eaten and much wine drunk. Cyrus served wine to his army, and Persian councils never undertook serious discussions of policy when sober, though they took care to revise their decisions the next morning. One intoxicating drink, the haoma, was offered as a pleasant sacrifice to the gods, and was believed to engender in its addicts not excitement and anger, but righteousness and piety. Industry was poorly developed in Persia. She was content to let the nations of the Near East practice the handicrafts while she bought their products with their imperial tribute. She showed more originality in the improvement of communications and transport. Engineers, under the instructions of Darius I, built great roads uniting the various capitals. One of these highways, from Susa to Sardis, was 1,500 miles long. The roads were accurately measured by parasangs, 3.4 miles, and at every fourth parasang, says Herodotus, There are royal stations and excellent inns, and the whole road is through an inhabited and safe country. At each station a fresh relay of horses stood ready to carry on the mail, so that, though the ordinary traveler required 90 days to go from Susa to Sardis, the royal mail moved over the distance as quickly as an automobile party does now, that is, in a little less than a week. The larger rivers were crossed by ferries, but the engineers could, when they wished, throw across the Euphrates, even across the Hellespont, substantial bridges over which hundreds of skeptical elephants could pass in safety. Other roads led through the Afghanistan passes to India, and made Susa a halfway house to the already fabulous riches of the East. These roads were built primarily for military and governmental purposes, to facilitate central control and administration. But they served also to stimulate commerce and the exchange of customs, ideas, and the indispensable superstitions of mankind. Along these roads, for example, angels and the devil passed from Persian into Jewish and Christian mythology. Navigation was not so vigorously advanced as land transportation. The Persians had no fleet of their own, but merely engaged or conscripted the vessels of the Phoenicians and the Greeks. Darius built a great canal uniting Persia with the Mediterranean through the Red Sea and the Nile, but the carelessness of his successors soon surrendered this achievement to the shifting sands. When Xerxes royally commanded part of his naval forces to circumnavigate Africa, it turned back in disgrace shortly after passing through the Pillars of Hercules. Commerce was for the most part abandoned to foreigners, Babylonians, Phoenicians, and Jews. The Persians despised trade and looked upon a marketplace as a breeding ground of lies. The wealthy classes took pride in supplying most of their wants directly from their own fields and shops, not contaminating their fingers with either buying or selling. Payments, loans, and interest were at first in the form of goods, especially cattle and grain. Coinage came later from Lydia. Darius issued gold and silver darics, stamped with his features, and valued at a gold-to-silver ratio of 13.5 to 1. This was the origin of the bimetallic ratio in modern currencies. 4. An experiment in government. The king, the nobles, the army, law, a savage punishment, the capitals, the satrapies, an achievement in administration. The life of Persia was political and military rather than economic. Its wealth was based not on industry but on power. It existed precariously as a little governing isle in an immense and unnaturally subject sea. The imperial organization that maintained this artifact was one of the most unique and competent in history. At its head was the king, or Kshatra, that is, warrior. The title indicates the military origin and character of the Persian monarchy. Since lesser kings were vassal to him, the Persian ruler entitled himself King of Kings, and the ancient world made no protest against his claim. The Greeks called him simply Basileus, the king. His power was theoretically absolute. He could kill with the word without trial or reason given, after the manner of some very modern dictator. And occasionally he delegated to his mother or his chief wife this privilege of capricious slaughter. Few even of the greatest nobles dared offer any criticism or rebuke, and public opinion was cautiously impotent. The father whose innocent son had been shot before his eyes by the king merely complimented the monarch on his excellent archery. Offenders, bastinadoed by the royal order, thanked his majesty for keeping them in mind. The king might rule as well as reign, if, like Cyrus and the first Darius, he cared to bestir himself, but the later monarchs delegated most of the cares of government to noble subordinates or imperial eunuchs, and spent their time at love, dice, or the chase. The court was overrun with eunuchs who, from their coigns of vantage as guards of the harem and pedagogues to the princes, stewed a poisonous brew of intrigue in every reign. The king had the right to choose his successor from among his sons, but ordinarily the succession was determined by assassination and revolution. The royal power was limited in practice by the strength of the aristocracy that mediated between the people and the throne. It was a matter of custom that the 6 families of the men who had shared with Darius I the dangers of the revolt against false Smerdis should have exceptional privileges and be consulted in all matters of vital interest. Many of the nobles attended court and served as a council for whose advice the monarch usually showed the highest regard. Most members of the aristocracy were attached to the throne by receiving their estates from the king. In return, they provided him with men and materials when he took the field. Within their fiefs they had almost complete authority, levying taxes, enacting laws, executing judgment, and maintaining their own armed forces. The real basis of the royal power and imperial government was the army. An empire exists only so long as it retains its superior capacity to kill. The obligation to enlist on any declaration of war fell upon every able-bodied male from 15 to 50 years of age. When the father of 3 sons petitioned Darius to exempt one of them from service, all 3 were put to death. And when another father, having sent 4 sons to the battlefield, begged Xerxes to permit the 5th son to stay behind and manage the family estate, the body of this 5th son was cut in 2 by royal order and placed on both sides of the road by which the army was to pass. The troops marched off to war amid the blare of martial music and the plaudits of citizens above the military age. The spearhead of the army was the royal guard, 2,000 horsemen and 2,000 infantry, all nobles, whose function it was to guard the king. The standing army consisted exclusively of Persians and Medes, and from this permanent force came most of the garrisons stationed as centers of persuasion at strategic points in the empire. The complete force consisted of levies from every subject nation, each group with its own distinct language, weapons, and habits of war. Its equipment and retinue was as varied as its origin: bows and arrows, scimitars, javelins, daggers, pikes, slings, knives, shields, helmets, leather cuirasses, coats of mail, horses, elephants, heralds, scribes, eunuchs, prostitutes, concubines, and chariots armed on each hub with great steel scythes. The whole mass, though vast in number and amounting in the expedition of Xerxes to 1,800,000 men, never achieved unity, and at the first sign of a reverse it became a disorderly mob. It conquered by mere force of numbers, by an elastic capacity for absorbing casualties. It was destined to be overthrown as soon as it should encounter a well-organized army speaking one speech and accepting one discipline. This was the secret of Marathon and Plataea. In such a state the only law was the will of the king and the power of the army. No rights were sacred against these, and no precedents could avail except an earlier decree of the king. For it was a proud boast of Persia that its laws never changed, and that a royal promise or decree was irrevocable. In his edicts and judgments the king was supposed to be inspired by the god Ahura Mazda himself. Therefore the law of the realm was the divine will, and any infraction of it was an offense against the deity. The king was the supreme court, but it was his custom to delegate this function to some learned elder in his retinue. Below him was a high court of justice with 7 members, and below this were local courts scattered through the realm. The priests formulated the law, and for a long time acted as judges. In later days laymen, even lay women, sat in judgment. Bail was accepted in all but the most important cases, and a regular procedure of trial was followed. The court occasionally decreed rewards as well as punishments, and in considering a crime weighed against it the good record and services of the accused. The law's delays were mitigated by fixing a time limit for each case, and by proposing to all disputants an arbitrator of their own choice, who might bring them to a peaceable settlement. As the law gathered precedence and complexity, a class of men arose called speakers of the law, who offered to explain it to litigants and help them conduct their cases. Oaths were taken, and use was occasionally made of the ordeal. Bribery was discouraged by making the tender or acceptance of it a capital offense. Cambyses improved the integrity of the courts by causing an unjust judge to be flayed alive, and using his skin to upholster the judicial bench, to which he then appointed the dead judge's son. Minor punishments took the form of flogging, from 5 to 200 blows with a horsewhip. The poisoning of a shepherd dog received 200 strokes, manslaughter 90. The administration of the law was partly financed by commuting stripes into fines at the rate of 6 rupees to a stripe. More serious crimes were punished with branding, maiming, mutilation, blinding, imprisonment, or death. The letter of the law forbade anyone, even the king, to sentence a man to death for a simple crime, but it could be decreed for treason, rape, sodomy, murder, self-pollution, burning or burying the dead, intrusion upon the king's privacy, approaching one of his concubines, accidentally sitting upon his throne, or for any displeasure to the ruling house. Death was procured in such cases by poisoning, impaling, crucifixion, hanging, usually with the head down, stoning, burying the body up to the head, crushing the head between huge stones, smothering the victim in hot ashes, or by the incredibly cruel rite called the boats. Because the soldier Mithridates in his cups blurted out the fact that it was he and not the king who should have received credit for slaying Cyrus the Younger at the Battle of Cunaxa, Artaxerxes II, says Plutarch, decreed that Mithridates should be put to death in boats. which execution is after the following manner. Taking two boats framed exactly to fit and answer each other, they lay down in one of them the malefactor that suffers upon his back, then covering it with the other, and so setting them together that the head, hands, and feet of him are left outside, and the rest of his body lies shut up within, they offer him food, and if he refuse to eat it, they force him to do it by pricking his eyes. Then, after he has eaten, they drench him with a mixture of milk and honey, pouring it not only into his mouth but all over his face. They then keep his face continually turned toward the sun, and it becomes completely covered up and hidden by the multitude of flies that settle upon it. And as within the boats he does what those that eat and drink must do, creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed. When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon, and, as it were, growing to his innards. In this way Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired. Some of these barbarous punishments were bequeathed to the invading Turks of a later age and passed down into the heritage of mankind. With these laws and this army, the king sought to govern his 20 satrapies from his many capitals, originally Pasargadae, occasionally Persepolis, in summer Ecbatana, usually Susa. Here in the ancient capital of Elam, the history of the ancient Near East came full circle, binding the beginning and the end. Susa had the advantage of inaccessibility and the disadvantages of distance. Alexander had to come 2,000 miles to take it, but it had to send its troops 1,500 miles to suppress revolts in Lydia or Egypt. Ultimately, the great roads merely paved the way for the physical conquest of Western Asia by Greece and Rome, and the theological conquest of Greece and Rome by Western Asia. The empire was divided into provinces or satrapies for convenience of administration and taxation. Each province was governed in the name of the king of kings, sometimes by a vassal prince, ordinarily by a satrap, ruler, royally appointed for as long a time as he could retain favor at the court. To keep the satraps in hand, Darius sent to each province a general to control its armed forces independently of the governor, and to make matters trebly sure he appointed in each province a secretary, independent of both satrap and general, to report their behavior to the king. As a further precaution, an intelligence service known as the King's Eyes and Ears might appear at any moment to examine the affairs, records, and finances of the province. Sometimes the satrap was deposed without trial, sometimes he was quietly poisoned by his servants at the order of the king. Underneath the satrap and the secretary was a horde of clerks who carried on so much of the government as had no direct need of force. This body of clerks carried over from one administration to another, even from reign to reign. The king dies, but the bureaucracy is immortal. Salaries of these provincial officials were paid not by the king, but by the people whom they ruled. The remuneration was ample enough to provide the satraps with palaces, harems, and extensive hunting parks to which the Persians gave the historic name of paradise. In addition, each satrapy was required to send the king, annually, a fixed amount of money and goods by way of taxation. India sent 4,680 talents, Assyria and Babylonia 1,000, Egypt 700, the 4 satrapies of Asia Minor 1,760, etc., making a total of some 14,560 talents, variously estimated as equivalent to from $160 to $218 million a year. Furthermore, each province was expected to contribute to the king's needs in goods and supplies. Egypt had to furnish corn annually for 120,000 men. The Medes provided 100,000 sheep, the Armenians 30,000 foals, the Babylonians 500 young eunuchs. Other sources of wealth swelled the central revenue to such a point that when Alexander captured the Persian capitals after 150 years of Persian extravagance, after 100 expensive revolts and wars, and after Darius III had carried off 8,000 talents with him in his flight, he found 180,000 talents left in the royal treasuries, some $2,700,000,000. Despite these high charges for its services, the Persian Empire was the most successful experiment in imperial government that the Mediterranean world would know before the coming of Rome, which was destined to inherit much of the earlier empire's political structure and administrative forms. The cruelty and dissipation of the later monarchs, the occasional barbarism of the laws, and the heavy burdens of taxation were balanced, as human governments go, by such order and peace as made the provinces rich despite these levies, and by such liberty as only the most enlightened empires have accorded to subject states. Each region retained its own language, laws, customs, morals, religion, and coinage, and sometimes its native dynasty of kings. Many of the tributary nations, like Babylonia, Phoenicia, and Palestine, were well satisfied with the situation, and suspected that their own generals and tax-gatherers would have plucked them even more ferociously. Under Darius I, the Persian Empire was an achievement in political organization. Only Trajan, Hadrian, and the Antonines would equal it. 5. Zarathustra. The coming of the prophet, Persian religion before Zarathustra, the Bible of Persia, Ahura Mazda, the good and the evil spirits, their struggle for the possession of the world. Persian legend tells how, many hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, a great prophet appeared in Aryana Vaijo, the ancient home of the Aryans. His people called him Zarathustra, but the Greeks, who could never bear the orthography of the barbarians patiently, called him Zoroastres. His conception was divine. His guardian angel entered into an haoma plant, and passed with its juice into the body of a priest as the latter offered divine sacrifice. At the same time a ray of heaven's glory entered the bosom of a maid of noble lineage. The priest espoused the maid, the imprisoned angel mingled with the imprisoned ray, and Zarathustra began to be. He laughed aloud on the very day of his birth, and the evil spirits that gather around every life fled from him in tumult and terror. Out of his great love for wisdom and righteousness, he withdrew from the society of men, and chose to live in a mountain wilderness on cheese and the fruits of the soil. The devil tempted him, but to no avail. His breast was pierced with a sword, and his entrails were filled with molten lead. He did not complain, but clung to his faith in Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, as supreme God. Ahura Mazda appeared to him and gave into his hands the Avesta, or book of knowledge and wisdom, and bade him preach it to mankind. For a long time all the world ridiculed and persecuted him, but at last a high prince of Iran, Vishtaspa, or Hystaspes, heard him gladly and promised to spread the new faith among his people. Thus was the Zoroastrian religion born. Zarathustra himself lived to a very old age, was consumed in a flash of lightning, and descended into heaven. We cannot tell how much of his story is true. Perhaps some Josiah discovered him. The Greeks accepted him as historical and honored him with an antiquity of 5,500 years before their time. Berosus the Babylonian brought him down to 2000 B.C. Modern historians, when they believe in his existence, assign to him any century between the 10th and the 6th before Christ. When he appeared among the ancestors of the Medes and the Persians, he found his people worshipping animals, ancestors, the earth, and the sun, in a religion having many elements and deities in common with the Hindus of the Vedic age. The chief divinities of this pre-Zoroastrian faith were Mithra, god of the sun, and Anaita, goddess of fertility and the earth, and Haoma, the bull god who, dying, rose again, and gave mankind his blood as a drink that would confer immortality. Him the early Iranians worshipped by drinking the intoxicating juice of the Haoma herb found on their mountain slopes. Zarathustra was shocked at these primitive deities and this Dionysian ritual. He rebelled against the Magi, or priests, who prayed and sacrificed to them, and with all the bravery of his contemporaries Amos and Isaiah, he announced to the world one God. Here, Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light and Heaven, of whom all other gods were but manifestations and qualities. Perhaps Darius I, who accepted the new doctrine, saw in it a faith that would both inspire his people and strengthen his government. From the moment of his accession, he declared war upon the old cults and the Magian priesthood, and made Zoroastrianism the religion of the state. The Bible of the new faith was the collection of books in which the disciples of the Master had gathered his sayings and his prayers. Later followers called these books Avesta. By the error of a modern scholar, they are known to the Occidental world as the Zendavesta. The contemporary non-Persian reader is terrified to find that the substantial volumes that survive, though much shorter than our Bible, are but a small fraction of the revelation vouchsafed to Zarathustra by his God. What remains is, to the foreign and provincial observer, a confused mass of prayers, songs, legends, prescriptions, ritual and morals, brightened now and then by noble language, fervent devotion, ethical elevation, or lyric piety. Like our Old Testament, it is a highly eclectic composition. The student discovers here and there the gods, the ideas, sometimes the very words and phrases of the Rig Veda, to such an extent that some Indian scholars consider the Avesta to have been inspired not by Ahura Mazda, but by the Vedas. At other times one comes upon passages of ancient Babylonian provenance, such as the creation of the world in 6 periods, the heavens, the waters, the earth, plants, animals, man, the descent of all men from 2 first parents, the establishment of an earthly paradise, the discontent of the Creator with his creation and his resolve to destroy all but a remnant of it by a flood. But the specifically Iranian elements suffice abundantly to characterize the whole. The world is conceived in dualistic terms as the stage of a conflict lasting 12,000 years between the god Ahura Mazda and the devil Ahriman. Purity and honesty are the greatest of the virtues, and will lead to everlasting life. The dead must not be buried or burned, as by the obscene Greeks or Hindus, but must be thrown to the dogs or to birds of prey. The god of Zarathustra was first of all the whole circle of the heavens themselves. Ahura Mazda clothes himself with the solid vault of the firmament as his raiment. His body is the light and the sovereign glory. The sun and the moon are his eyes. In later days, when the religion passed from prophets to politicians, the great deity was pictured as a gigantic king of imposing majesty. As creator and ruler of the world, he was assisted by a legion of lesser divinities, originally pictured as forms and powers of nature, fire and water, sun and moon, wind and rain. But it was the achievement of Zarathustra that he conceived his God as supreme over all things, in terms as noble as the book of Job. "This I ask thee, tell me truly, O Ahura Mazda. Who determined the paths of suns and stars? Who is it by whom the moon waxes and wanes? Who from below sustained the earth and the firmament from falling? Who sustained the waters and plants? Who yoked swiftness with the winds and the clouds? Who, Ahura Mazda, called forth the good mind?" This good mind meant not any human mind, but a divine wisdom, almost a logos, used by Ahura Mazda as an intermediate agency of creation. Zarathustra had interpreted Ahura Mazda as having 7 aspects or qualities: light, good mind, right, dominion, piety, well-being, and immortality. His followers, habituated to polytheism, interpreted these attributes as persons, called by them Ameshaspenta, or immortal holy ones, who, under the leadership of Ahura Mazda, created and managed the world. In this way, the majestic monotheism of the founder became, as in the case of Christianity, the polytheism of the people. In addition to these holy spirits were the guardian angels, of which Persian theology supplied one for every man, woman, and child. But just as these angels and the immortal holy ones helped men to virtue, so, according to the pious Persian, influenced presumably by Babylonian demonology, 7 divas, or evil spirits, hovered in the air, always tempting men to crime and sin, and forever engaged in a war upon Ahura Mazda and every form of righteousness. The leader of these devils was Angromynus, or Ahriman, prince of darkness and ruler of the netherworld, prototype of that busy Satan whom the Jews appear to have adopted from Persia and bequeathed to Christianity. It was Ahriman, for example, who had created serpents, vermin, locusts, ants, winter, darkness, crime, sin, sodomy, menstruation, and the other plagues of life. And it was these inventions of the devil that had ruined the paradise in which Ahura Mazda had placed the first progenitors of the human race. Zarathustra seems to have regarded these evil spirits as spurious deities, popular and superstitious incarnations of the abstract forces that resist the progress of man. His followers, however, found it easier to think of them as living beings, and personified them in such abundance that in after times the devils of Persian theology were numbered in millions. As this system of belief came from Zarathustra, it bordered upon monotheism. Even with the intrusion of Ahriman and the evil spirits, it remained as monotheistic as Christianity was to be, with its Satan, its devils, and its angels. Indeed, one hears in early Christian theology as many echoes of Persian dualism as of Hebrew Puritanism or Greek philosophy. The Zoroastrian conception of God might have satisfied as particular a spirit as Matthew Arnold. Ahura Mazda was the sum total of all those forces in the world that make for righteousness, and morality lay in cooperation with those forces. Furthermore, there was in this dualism a certain justice to the contradictoriness and perversity of things, which monotheism never provided. And though the Zoroastrian theologians, after the manner of Hindu mystics and scholastic philosophers, sometimes argued that evil was unreal, they offered in effect a theology well adapted to dramatize for the average mind the moral issues of life. The last act of the play, they promised, would be, for the just man, a happy ending, after 4 epochs of 3,000 years each, in which Ahura Mazda and Ahriman would alternately predominate. The forces of evil would be finally destroyed. Right would triumph everywhere, and evil would forever cease to be. Then all good men would join Ahura Mazda in paradise, and the wicked would fall into a gulf of outer darkness, where they would feed on poison eternally. 6. Zoroastrian Ethics. Man is a battlefield, the undying fire, hell, purgatory, and paradise, the cult of Mithra, the Magi, the Parsees. By picturing the world as the scene of a struggle between good and evil, the Zoroastrians established in the popular imagination a powerful supernatural stimulus and sanction for morals. The soul of man, like the universe, was represented as a battleground of beneficent and maleficent spirits. Every man was a warrior, whether he liked it or not, in the army of either the Lord or the devil. Every act or omission advanced the cause of Ahura Mazda or of Ahriman. It was an ethic even more admirable than the theology, if men must have supernatural supports for their morality. It gave to the common life a dignity and significance grander than any that could come to it from a worldview that looked upon man, in medieval phrase, as a helpless worm, or in modern terms, as a mechanical automaton. Human beings were not, to Zarathustra's thinking, mere pawns in this cosmic war. They had free will, since Ahura Mazda wished them to be personalities in their own right. They might freely choose whether they would follow the light or the lie. For Ahriman was the living lie, and every liar was his servant. Out of this general conception emerged a detailed but simple code of morals, centered about the golden rule. That nature alone is good, which shall not do unto another whatever is not good unto its own self. Man's duty, says the Avesta, is threefold: to make him who is an enemy a friend, to make him who is wicked righteous, and to make him who is ignorant learned. The greatest virtue is piety. Second only to that is honor and honesty in action and speech. Interest was not to be charged to Persians, but loans were to be looked upon as almost sacred. The worst sin of all, in the Avestan as in the Mosaic Code, is unbelief. We may judge from the severe punishments with which it was honored that skepticism existed among the Persians. Death was to be visited upon the apostate without delay. The generosity and kindliness enjoined by the master did not apply in practice to infidels, that is, foreigners. These were inferior species of men, whom Ahura Mazda had deluded into loving their own countries only in order that they should not invade Persia. The Persians, says Herodotus, esteem themselves to be far the most excellent of men in every respect. They believe that other nations approach to excellence according to their geographical proximity to Persia, but that they are the worst who live farthest from them. The words have a contemporary ring and a universal application. Piety being the greatest virtue, the first duty of life was the worship of God with purification, sacrifice, and prayer. Zoroastrian Persia tolerated neither temples nor idols. Altars were erected on hilltops, in palaces, or in the center of the city, and fires were kindled upon them in honor of Ahura Mazda or some lesser divinity. Fire itself was worshipped as a god, Attar, the very son of the Lord of Light. Every family centered round the hearth. To keep the home fire burning, never to let it be extinguished, was part of the ritual of faith. And the undying fire of the skies, the sun, was adored as the highest and most characteristic embodiment of Ahura Mazda, or Mithra, quite as Ikhnaton had worshipped it in Egypt. The morning sun, says the Scriptures, must be reverenced till midday, and that of midday must be reverenced till the afternoon, and that of the afternoon must be reverenced till evening. While men reverence not the sun, the good works which they do that day are not their own. To the sun, to fire, to Ahura Mazda, sacrifice was offered of flowers, bread, fruit, perfumes, oxen, sheep, camels, horses, asses, and stags. Anciently, as elsewhere, human victims had been offered too. The gods received only the odor. The edible portions were kept for the priests and the worshippers, for as the Magi explained, the gods required only the soul of the victim. Though the master abominated it, and there is no mention of it in the Avesta, the old Aryan offering of the intoxicating haoma juice to the gods continued far into Zoroastrian days. The priest drank part of the sacred fluid and divided the remainder among the faithful in Holy Communion. When people were too poor to offer such tasty sacrifices, they made up for it by adulatory prayer. Ahura Mazda, like Yahweh, liked to sip his praise, and made for the pious an imposing list of his accomplishments, which became a favorite Persian litany. Given a life of piety and truth, the Persian might face death unafraid. This, after all, is one of the secret purposes of religion. Astapahad, the god of death, finds everyone, no matter where. He is the confident seeker from whom not one of mortal men can escape, not those who go down deep, like Afrasiab the Turk, who made himself an iron palace under the earth, 1,000 times the height of a man, with 100 columns. In that palace he made the stars, the moon, and the sun go round, making the light of day. In that palace he did everything at his pleasure, and he lived the happiest life. With all his strength and witchcraft he could not escape from Astapahad. Nor he who dug this wide round earth with extremities that lie afar, like Dahak, who went from the east to the west searching for immortality and did not find it. With all his strength and power he could not escape from Astapahad. To everyone comes the unseen, deceiving Astapahad, who accepts neither compliments nor bribes, who is no respecter of persons, and ruthlessly makes men perish. And yet, for it is in the nature of religion to threaten and terrify as well as to console, the Persian could not look upon death unafraid unless he had been a faithful warrior in Ahura Mazda's cause. Beyond that most awful of all mysteries lay a hell and a purgatory as well as a paradise. All dead souls would have to pass over a sifting bridge. The good soul would come on the other side to the abode of song, where it would be welcomed by a young maiden radiant and strong, with well-developed bust, and would live in happiness with Ahura Mazda to the end of time. But the wicked soul, failing to get across, would fall into as deep a level of hell as was adjusted to its degree of wickedness. This hell was no mere Hades, to which, as in earlier religions, all the dead descended, whether good or bad. It was an abyss of darkness and terror, in which condemned souls suffered torments to the end of the world. If a man's virtues outweighed his sins, he would endure the cleansing of a temporary punishment. If he had sinned much but had done good works, he would suffer for only 12,000 years, and then would rise into heaven. Already, the good Zoroastrians tell us, the divine consummation of history approaches. The birth of Zarathustra began the last world epoch of 3,000 years. After 3 prophets of his seed have, at intervals, carried his doctrine throughout the world, the last judgment will be pronounced. The kingdom of Ahura Mazda will come, and Ahriman and all the forces of evil will be utterly destroyed. Then all good souls will begin life anew in a world without evil, darkness, or pain. The dead shall rise, life shall return to the bodies, and they shall breathe again. The whole physical world shall become free from old age and death, from corruption and decay, forever and ever. Here again, as in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we hear the threat of that awful last judgment which seems to have passed from Persian to Jewish eschatology in the days of the Persian ascendancy in Palestine. It was an admirable formula for frightening children into obeying their parents. Since one function of religion is to ease the difficult and necessary task of disciplining the young by the old, we must grant to the Zoroastrian priests a fine professional skill in the brewing of theology. All in all, it was a splendid religion, less warlike and bloody, less idolatrous and superstitious than the other religions of its time, and it did not deserve to die so soon. For a while, under Darius I, it became the spiritual expression of a nation at its height. But humanity loves poetry more than logic, and without a myth the people perish. Underneath the official worship of Ahura Mazda, the cult of Mithra and Anaita, god of the sun and goddess of vegetation and fertility, generation and sex, continued to find devotees, and in the days of Artaxerxes II their names began to appear again in the royal inscriptions. Thereafter Mithra grew powerfully in favor, and Ahura Mazda faded away until, in the first centuries of our era, the cult of Mithra as a divine youth of beautiful countenance, with a radiant halo over his head as a symbol of his ancient identity with the sun, spread throughout the Roman Empire, and shared in giving Christmas to Christianity. Christmas was originally a solar festival, celebrating at the winter solstice, about December 22nd, the lengthening of the day and the triumph of the sun over his enemies. It became a Mithraic and finally a Christian holy day. Zarathustra, had he been immortal, would have been scandalized to find statues of Anaita, the Persian Aphrodite, set up in many cities of the empire within a few centuries after his death. And surely it would not have pleased him to find so many pages of his revelation devoted to magic formulas for healing, divination, and sorcery. After his death, the old priesthood of wise men or magi conquered him as priesthoods conquer in the end every vigorous rebel or heretic, by adopting and absorbing him into their theology. They numbered him among the magi and forgot him. By an austere and monogamous life, by 1,000 precise observances of sacred ritual and ceremonial cleanliness, by abstention from flesh food, and by a simple and unpretentious dress, the Magi acquired, even among the Greeks, a high reputation for wisdom, and among their own people an almost boundless influence. The Persian kings themselves became their pupils, and took no step of consequence without consulting them. The higher ranks among them were sages, the lower were diviners and sorcerers, readers of stars and interpreters of dreams. The very word magic is taken from their name. Year by year the Zoroastrian elements in Persian religion faded away. They were revived for a time under the Sassanid dynasty, 226 to 651 A.D., but were finally eliminated by the Moslem and Tatar invasions of Persia. Zoroastrianism survives today only among small communities in the province of Fars, and among the 90,000 Parsis of India. These devotedly preserve and study the ancient scriptures, worship fire, earth, water, and air as sacred, and expose their dead in towers of silence to birds of prey, lest burning or burial should defile the holy elements. They are a people of excellent morals and character, a living tribute to the civilizing effect of Zarathustra's doctrine upon mankind. 7. Persian manners and morals. Violence and honor, the code of cleanliness, sins of the flesh, virgins and bachelors, marriage, women, children, Persian ideas of education. Nevertheless, it is surprising how much brutality remained in the Medes and the Persians despite their religion. Darius I, their greatest king, writes in the Behistun inscription, "Favartish was seized and brought to me. I cut off his nose and ears, and I cut out his tongue, and I put out his eyes. At my court he was kept in chains. All the people saw him. Later I crucified him in Ecbatana. Ahura Mazda was my strong support. Under the protection of Ahura Mazda my army utterly smote the rebellious army, and they seized Citrankankara and brought him to me. Then I cut off his nose and ears and put out his eyes. He was kept in chains at my court. All the people saw him. Afterwards I crucified him." The murders retailed in Plutarch's life of Artaxerxes II offer a sanguinary specimen of the morals of the later courts. Traitors were dealt with without sentiment. They and their leaders were crucified, their followers were sold as slaves, their towns were pillaged, their boys were castrated, the girls were sold into harems. But it would be unfair to judge the people from their kings. Virtue is not news, and virtuous men, like happy nations, have no history. Even the kings showed on occasion a fine generosity, and were known among the faithless Greeks for their fidelity. A treaty made with them could be relied upon, and it was their boast that they never broke their word. It is a testimony to the character of the Persians that whereas anyone could hire Greeks to fight Greeks, it was rare indeed that a Persian could be hired to fight Persians. Manners were milder than the blood and iron of history would suggest. The Persians were free and open in speech, generous, warm-hearted, and hospitable. Etiquette was almost as punctilious among them as with the Chinese. When equals met, they embraced and kissed each other on the lips. To persons of higher rank they made a deep obeisance. To those of lower rank they offered the cheek. To commoners they bowed. They thought it unbecoming to eat or drink anything in the street, or publicly to spit or blow the nose. Until the reign of Xerxes, the people were abstemious in food and drink, eating only one meal per day, and drinking nothing but water. Cleanliness was rated as the greatest good after life itself. Good works done with dirty hands were worthless. For while one doth not utterly destroy corruption, germs, there is no coming of the angels to his body. Severe penalties were decreed for those who spread contagious diseases. On festal occasions the people gathered together all clothed in white. The Avestan code, like the Brahmin and the Mosaic, heaped up ceremonial precautions and ablutions. Great arid tracts of the Zoroastrian scriptures are given over to wearisome formulas for cleansing the body and the soul. Parings of nails, cuttings of hair, and exhalations of the breath were marked out as unclean things, which the wise Persian would avoid unless they had been purified. The code was again Judaically stern against the sins of the flesh. Onanism was to be punished with flogging, and men and women guilty of sexual promiscuity or prostitution ought to be slain even more than gliding serpents, than howling wolves. That practice kept its usual distance from precept appears from an item in Herodotus. To carry off women by violence the Persians think is the act of wicked men, but to trouble oneself about avenging them when so carried off is the act of foolish men, and to pay no regard to them when carried off is the act of wise men. for it is clear that if they had not been willing, they could not have been carried off. He adds elsewhere that the Persians have learnt from the Greeks a passion for boys, and though we cannot always trust this supreme reporter, we sent some corroboration of him in the intensity with which the Avesta excoriates sodomy. For that deed, it says again and again, there is no forgiveness. Nothing can wash it away. Virgins and bachelors were not encouraged by the code, but polygamy and concubinage were allowed. A military society has use for many children. The man who has a wife, says the Avesta, is far above him who lives in continence. He who keeps a house is far above him who has none. He who has children is far above him who has none. He who has riches is far above him who has none. These are criteria of social standing fairly common among the nations. The family is ranked as the holiest of all institutions. O maker of the material world, Zarathustra asks Ahura Mazda, thou Holy One, which is the second place where the earth feels most happy? And Ahura Mazda answers him, it is the place whereon one of the faithful erects a house with a priest within, with cattle, with a wife, with children, and good herds within. And wherein afterwards the cattle continue to thrive, the wife to thrive, the child to thrive, the fire to thrive, and every blessing of life to thrive. The animal, above all others the dog, was an integral part of the family, as in the last commandment given to Moses. The nearest family was enjoined to take in and care for any homeless pregnant beast. Severe penalties were prescribed for those who fed unfit food to dogs or served them their food too hot, and 1,400 stripes were the punishment for smiting a bitch which has been covered by 3 dogs. The bull was honored for his procreative powers, and prayer and sacrifice were offered to the cow. Matches were arranged by the parents on the arrival of their children at puberty. The range of choice was wide, for we hear of the marriage of brother and sister, father and daughter, mother and son. Concubines were for the most part a luxury of the rich. The aristocracy never went to war without them. In the later days of the empire, the king's harem contained from 329 to 360 concubines, for it had become a custom that no woman might share the royal couch twice, unless she was overwhelmingly beautiful. In the time of the prophet, the position of woman in Persia was high, as ancient manners went. She moved in public freely and unveiled. She owned and managed property, and could, like most modern women, direct the affairs of her husband in his name or through his pen. After Darius, her status declined, especially among the rich. The poorer women retained their freedom of movement because they had to work, but in other cases the seclusion always enforced in the menstrual periods was extended to the whole social life of woman, and laid the foundations of the Moslem institution of purdah. Upper-class women could not venture out except in curtained litters, and were not permitted to mingle publicly with men. Married women were forbidden to see even their nearest male relatives, such as their fathers or brothers. Women are never mentioned or represented in the public inscriptions and monuments of ancient Persia. Concubines had greater freedom, since they were employed to entertain their masters' guests. Even in the later reigns women were powerful at the court, rivaling the eunuchs in the persistence of their plotting and the kings in the refinements of their cruelty. Statira was a model queen to Artaxerxes II, but his mother, Persides, poisoned her out of jealousy, encouraged the king to marry his own daughter, Atossa, played dice with him for the life of a eunuch, and winning had him flayed alive. When Artaxerxes ordered the execution of a Carian soldier, Persides bettered his instructions by having the man stretched upon the rack for 10 days, his eyes torn out, and molten lead poured into his ears until he died. Children as well as marriage were indispensable to respectability. Sons were highly valued as economic assets to their parents and military assets to the king. Girls were regretted, for they had to be brought up for some other man's home and profit. Men do not pray for daughters, said the Persians, and angels do not reckon them among their gifts to mankind. The king annually sent gifts to every father of many sons, as if in advance payment for their blood. Fornication, even adultery, might be forgiven if there was no abortion. Abortion was a worse crime than the others, and was to be punished with death. One of the ancient commentaries, the Bundahish, specifies means for avoiding conception, but warns the people against them. On the nature of generation, it is said in Revelation that a woman, when she cometh out from menstruation during 10 days and nights, when they go near unto her, readily becometh pregnant. The child remained under the care of the women till 5, and under the care of his father from 5 to 7. At 7 he went to school. Education was mostly confined to the sons of the well-to-do, and was usually administered by priests. Classes met in the temple or the home of the priest. It was a principle never to have a school meet near a marketplace, lest the atmosphere of lying, swearing, and cheating that prevailed in the bazaars should corrupt the young. The texts were the Avesta and its commentaries. The subjects were religion, medicine, or law. The method of learning was by commission to memory and by the rote recitation of long passages. Boys of the unpretentious classes were not spoiled with letters, but were taught only 3 things: to ride a horse, to use the bow, and to speak the truth. Higher education extended to the age of 20 or 24 among the sons of the aristocracy. Some were especially prepared for public office or provincial administration. All were trained in the art of war. The life in these higher schools was arduous. The students rose early, ran great distances, rode difficult horses at high speed, swam, hunted, pursued thieves, sowed farms, planted trees, made long marches under a hot sun or in bitter cold, and learned to bear every change and rigor of climate, to subsist on coarse foods, and to cross rivers while keeping their clothes and armor dry. It was such a schooling as would have gladdened the heart of Friedrich Nietzsche in those moments when he could forget the bright and varied culture of ancient Greece. 8. Science and art. Medicine, minor arts, the tombs of Cyrus and Darius, the palaces of Persepolis, the frieze of the archers, estimate of Persian art. The Persians seem to have deliberately neglected to train their children in any other art than that of life. Literature was a delicacy for which they had small use. Science was a commodity which they could import from Babylon. They had a certain relish for poetry and romantic fiction, but they left these arts to hirelings and inferiors, preferring the exhilaration of keen-witted conversation to the quiet and solitary pleasures of reading and research. Poetry was sung rather than read, and perished with the singers. Medicine was at first a function of the priests, who practiced it on the principle that the devil had created 99,999 diseases, which should be treated by a combination of magic and hygiene. They resorted more frequently to spells than to drugs, on the ground that the spells, though they might not cure the illness, would not kill the patient, which was more than could be said for the drugs. Nevertheless, lay medicine developed along with the growing wealth of Persia, and in the time of Artaxerxes II there was a well-organized guild of physicians and surgeons, whose fees were fixed by law, as in Hammurabi's code, according to the social rank of the patient. Priests were to be treated free, and just as among ourselves the medical novice practices for a year or two, as intern, upon the bodies of the immigrant and the poor, so among the Persians a young physician was expected to begin his career by treating infidels and foreigners. The Lord of Light himself had decreed it. O Maker of the material world, thou Holy One, if a worshipper of God wish to practice the art of healing, on whom shall he first prove his skill? On the worshippers of Ahura Mazda, or on the worshippers of the Daivas, the evil spirits? Ahura Mazda made answer and said, On worshippers of the Daivas shall he prove himself rather than on worshippers of God. If he treat with the knife a worshipper of the Daivas, and he die, if he treat with the knife a second worshipper of the Daivas, and he die, if he treat with the knife a third worshipper of the Daivas, and he die, he is unfit forever and ever. Let him never attend any worshipper of God. If he treat with the knife a worshipper of the Daivas, and he recover, if he treat with the knife a second worshipper of the Daivas, and he recover, if he treat with the knife a third worshipper of the Daivas, and he recover, then he is fit forever and ever. He may at his will treat worshippers of God, and heal them with the knife. Having dedicated themselves to empire, the Persians found their time and energies taken up with war, and, like the Romans, depended largely upon imports for their art. They had a taste for pretty things, but they relied upon foreign or foreign-born artists to produce them, and upon provincial revenues to pay for them. They had beautiful homes and luxuriant gardens, which sometimes became hunting parks or zoological collections. They had costly furniture, tables plated or inlaid with silver or gold, couches spread with exotic coverlets, floors carpeted with rugs resilient in texture and rich in all the colors of earth and sky. They drank from golden goblets and adorned their tables or their shelves with vases turned by foreign hands. They liked song and dance, and the playing of the harp, the flute, the drum, and the tambourine. Jewelry abounded, from tiaras and earrings to golden anklets and shoes. Even the men flaunted jewels on necks and ears and arms. Pearls, rubies, emeralds, and lapis lazuli came from abroad, but turquoise came from the Persian mines and contributed the customary material for the aristocrat's signet ring. Gems of monstrous and grotesque form copied the supposed features of favorite devils. The king sat on a golden throne covered with golden canopies, upheld with pillars of gold. Only in architecture did the Persians achieve a style of their own. Under Cyrus, Darius I, and Xerxes I, they erected tombs and palaces which archaeology has very incompletely exhumed. And it may be that those prying historians, the pick and the shovel, will in the near future raise our estimate of Persian art. At Pasargadae, Alexander spared for us with characteristic graciousness the tomb of Cyrus I. The caravan road now crosses the bare platform that once bore the palaces of Cyrus and his mad son. Of these nothing survives except a few broken columns here and there, or a door jamb bearing the features of Cyrus in bas-relief. Nearby on the plain is the tomb, showing the wear of 24 centuries, a simple stone chapel, quite Greek in restraint and form, rising to some 35 feet in height upon a terraced base. Once, surely, it was a loftier monument with some fitting pedestal. Today it seems a little bare and forlorn, having the shape but hardly the substance of beauty. The cracked and ruined stones merely chasten us with the quiet permanence of the inanimate. Far south at Nakshi Rustam, near Persepolis, is the tomb of Darius I, cut like some Hindu chapel into the face of the mountain rock. The entrance is carved to simulate a palace facade, with 4 slender columns about a modest portal. Above it, as if on a roof, figures representing the subject peoples of Persia support a dais on which the king is shown worshipping Ahura Mazda and the moon. It is conceived and executed with aristocratic refinement and simplicity. The rest of such Persian architecture as has survived the wars, raids, thefts, and weather of 2 millenniums is composed of palace ruins. At Ecbatana, the early kings built a royal residence of cedar and cypress, plated with metal, which still stood in the days of Polybius, circa 150 B.C., but of which no sign remains. The most imposing relics of ancient Persia, now rising day by day out of the grasping and secretive earth, are the stone steps, platform, and columns at Persepolis. For there each monarch from Darius onward built a palace to defer the oblivion of his name. The great external stairs that mounted from the plain to the elevation on which the buildings rested were unlike anything else in architectural records, derived presumably from the flights of steps that approached and encircled the Mesopotamian ziggurats. They had nevertheless a character specifically their own, so gradual in ascent and so spacious that 10 horsemen could mount them abreast. They must have formed a brilliant approach to the vast platform, 20 to 50 feet high, 1,500 feet long, and 1,000 feet wide, that bore the royal palaces. Underneath the platform ran a complicated system of drainage tunnels, 6 feet in diameter, often drilled through the solid rock. Where the 2 flights of steps, coming from either side, met at their summit, stood a gateway or propylaeum, flanked by winged and human-headed bulls in the worst Assyrian style. At the right stood the masterpiece of Persian architecture, the Chehil Minar, or Great Hall of Xerxes I, covering, with its roomy antechambers, an area of more than 100,000 square feet, vaster, if size mattered, than vast Karnak or any European cathedral except Milan's. Another flight of steps led to this great hall. These stairs were flanked with ornamental parapets, and their supporting sides were carved with the finest bas-reliefs yet discovered in Persia. 13 of the once 72 columns of Xerxes' palace stand among the ruins, like palm trees in some desolate oasis. And these marble columns, though mutilated, are among the nearly perfect works of man. They are slenderer than any columns of Egypt or Greece, and rise to the unusual height of 64 feet. Their shafts are fluted with 48 small grooves. Their bases resemble bells overlaid with inverted leaves. Their capitals, for the most part, take the form of floral, almost Ionic volutes, surmounted by the forequarters of 2 bulls or unicorns, upon whose necks, joined back to back, rested the crossbeam or architrave. This was surely of wood, for such fragile columns so wide apart could hardly have supported a stone entablature. The door jambs and window frames were of ornamented black stone that shone like ebony. The walls were of brick, but they were covered with enameled tiles painted in brilliant panels of animals and flowers. The columns, pilasters, and steps were of fine white limestone or hard blue marble. Behind or east of this Chehil Minar rose the Hall of 100 Columns. Nothing remains of it but 1 pillar and the outlines of the general plan. Possibly these palaces were the most beautiful ever erected in the ancient or modern world. At Susa, the Artaxerxes I and II built palaces of which only the foundations survive. They were constructed of brick, redeemed by the finest glazed tiles known. From Susa comes the famous frieze of the archers, probably the faithful immortals who guarded the king. The stately bowmen seemed dressed rather for court ceremony than for war. Their tunics resound with bright colors, their hair and beards are wondrously curled, their hands bear proudly and stiffly their official staffs. In Susa, as in the other capitals, painting and sculpture were dependent arts serving architecture, and the statuary was mostly the work of artists imported from Assyria, Babylonia, and Greece. One might say of Persian art, as perhaps of nearly every art, that all the elements of it were borrowed. The tomb of Cyrus took its form from Lydia, the slender stone columns improved upon the like pillars of Assyria, the colonnades and bas-reliefs acknowledged their inspiration from Egypt, the animal capitals were an infection from Nineveh and Babylon. It was the ensemble that made Persian architecture individual and different, an aristocratic taste that refined the overwhelming columns of Egypt and the heavy masses of Mesopotamia into the brilliance and elegance, the proportion and harmony of Persepolis. The Greeks would hear with wonder and admiration of these halls and palaces. Their busy travelers and observant diplomats would bring them stimulating word of the art and luxury of Persia. Soon they would transform the double volutes and stiff-necked animals of these graceful pillars into the smooth lobes of the Ionic capital. They would shorten and strengthen the shafts to make them bear any entablature, whether of wood or of stone. Architecturally there was but a step from Persepolis to Athens. All the Near Eastern world, about to die for 1,000 years, prepared to lay its heritage at the feet of Greece. 9. Decadence. How a Nation May Die. Xerxes, a paragraph of murders. Artaxerxes II, Cyrus the Younger, Darius the Little, causes of decay, political, military, moral. Alexander conquers Persia and advances upon India. The empire of Darius lasted hardly a century. The moral as well as the physical backbone of Persia was broken by Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea. The emperors exchanged Mars for Venus, and the nation descended into corruption and apathy. The decline of Persia anticipated almost in detail the decline of Rome. Immorality and degeneration among the people accompanied violence and negligence on the throne. The Persians, like the Medes before them, passed from Stoicism to Epicureanism in a few generations. Eating became the principal occupation of the aristocracy. These men who had once made it a rule to eat but once a day now interpreted the rule to allow them one meal, prolonged from noon to night. They stocked their larders with 1,000 delicacies, and often served entire animals to their guests. They stuffed themselves with rich, rare meats, and spent their genius upon new sauces and desserts. A corrupt and corrupting multitude of menials filled the houses of the wealthy, while drunkenness became the common vice of every class. Cyrus and Darius created Persia, Xerxes inherited it, his successors destroyed it. Xerxes I was every inch a king, externally. Tall and vigorous, he was by royal consent the handsomest man in his empire. But there was never yet a handsome man who was not vain, nor any physically vain man whom some woman has not led by the nose. Xerxes was divided by many mistresses, and became for his people an exemplar of sensuality. His defeat at Salamis was in the nature of things, for he was great only in his love of magnitude, not in his capacity to rise to a crisis, or to be, in fact, and need, a king. After 20 years of sexual intrigue and administrative indolence, he was murdered by a courtier, Artabanus, and was buried with regal pomp and general satisfaction. Only the records of Rome after Tiberius could rival in bloodiness the royal annals of Persia. The murderer of Xerxes was murdered by Artaxerxes I, who after a long reign was succeeded by Xerxes II, who was murdered a few weeks later by his half-brother, Sogdianus, who was murdered 6 months later by Darius II, who suppressed the revolt of Teratukmes by having him slain, his wife cut into pieces, and his mother, brothers, and sisters buried alive. Darius II was followed by his son Artaxerxes II, who at the Battle of Cunaxa had to fight to the death his own brother, the younger Cyrus, when the youth tried to seize the royal power. Artaxerxes II enjoyed a long reign, killed his son Darius for conspiracy, and died of a broken heart on finding that another son, Ochus, was planning to assassinate him. Ochus ruled for 20 years and was poisoned by his general Bagoas. This iron-livered Warwick placed Arses, son of Ochus, on the throne, assassinated Arses's brothers to make Arses secure, then assassinated Arses and his infant children, and gave the scepter to Codomanus, a safely effeminate friend. Codomanus reigned for 8 years under the name of Darius III, and died in battle against Alexander at Arbela, in the final ruin of his country. Not even the democracies of our time have known such indiscriminate leadership. It is in the nature of an empire to disintegrate soon, for the energy that created it disappears from those who inherit it, at the very time that its subject peoples are gathering strength to fight for their lost liberty. Nor is it natural that nations diverse in language, religion, morals, and traditions should long remain united. There is nothing organic in such a union, and compulsion must repeatedly be applied to maintain the artificial bond. In its 200 years of empire, Persia did nothing to lessen this heterogeneity, these centrifugal forces. She was content to rule a mob of nations and never thought of making them into a state. Year by year, the union became more difficult to preserve. As the vigor of the emperors relaxed, the boldness and ambition of the satraps grew. They purchased or intimidated the generals and secretaries who were supposed to share and limit their power. They arbitrarily enlarged their armies and revenues and engaged in recurrent plots against the king. The frequency of revolt and war exhausted the vitality of Little Persia. The braver stocks were slaughtered in battle after battle until none but the cautious survived, and when these were conscripted to face Alexander, they proved to be cowards almost to a man. No improvements had been made in the training or equipment of the troops or in the tactics of the generals. These blundered childishly against Alexander, while their disorderly ranks, armed mostly with darts, proved to be mere targets for the long spears and solid phalanxes of the Macedonians. Alexander frolicked, but only after the battle was won. The Persian leaders brought their concubines with them and had no ambition for war. The only real soldiers in the Persian army were the Greeks. From the day when Xerxes turned back defeated from Salamis, it became evident that Greece would one day challenge the empire. Persia controlled one end of the great trade route that bound Western Asia with the Mediterranean. Greece controlled the other, and the ancient acquisitiveness and ambition of men made such a situation provocative of war. As soon as Greece found a master who could give her unity, she would attack. Alexander crossed the Hellespont without opposition, having what seemed to Asia a negligible force of 30,000 footmen and 5,000 cavalry. A Persian army of 40,000 troops tried to stop him at Granicus. The Greeks lost 115 men, the Persians 20,000. Alexander marched south and east, taking cities and receiving surrenders for a year. Meanwhile, Darius III gathered a horde of 600,000 soldiers and adventurers. 5 days were required to march them over a bridge of boats across the Euphrates. 600 mules and 300 camels were needed to carry the royal purse. When the two armies met at Issus, Alexander had no more than 30,000 followers. But Darius, with all the stupidity that destiny could require, had chosen a field in which only a small part of his multitude could fight at one time. When the slaughter was over, the Macedonians had lost some 450, the Persians 110,000 men, most of these being slain in wild retreat. Alexander, in reckless pursuit, crossed a stream on a bridge of Persian corpses. Darius fled ignominiously, abandoning his mother, a wife, 2 daughters, his chariot, and his luxuriously appointed tent. Alexander treated the Persian ladies with a chivalry that surprised the Greek historians, contenting himself with marrying one of the daughters. If we may believe Quintus Curtius, the mother of Darius became so fond of Alexander that after his death she put an end to her own life by voluntary starvation. The young conqueror turned aside now with what seemed foolhardy leisureliness to establish his control over all of Western Asia. He did not wish to advance farther without organizing his conquests and building a secure line of communications. The citizens of Babylon, like those of Jerusalem, came out en masse to welcome him, offering him their city and their gold. He accepted these graciously and pleased them by restoring the temples which the unwise Xerxes had destroyed. Darius sent him a proposal of peace, saying that he would give Alexander 10,000 talents for the safe return of his mother, his wife, and his children, would offer him his daughter in marriage, and would acknowledge his sovereignty over all Asia west of the Euphrates, if only Alexander would end the war and become his friend. Parmenio, second in command among the Greeks, said that if he were Alexander he would be glad to accept such happy terms and avoid with honor the hazard of some disastrous defeat. Alexander remarked that he would do likewise, if he were Parmenio. Being Alexander, he answered Darius that his offer meant nothing, since he, Alexander, already possessed such parts of Asia as Darius proposed to cede to him, and could marry the daughter of the emperor when he pleased. Darius, despairing of peace with so reckless a logician, turned unwillingly to the task of collecting another and larger force. Meanwhile, Alexander had taken Tyre and annexed Egypt. Now he marched back across the great empire, straight to its distant capitals. In 20 days from Babylon his army reached Susa, and took it without resistance. Thence it advanced so quickly to Persepolis that the guards of the royal treasury had no time to secrete its funds. There Alexander committed one of the most unworthy acts of his incredible career. Against the counsel of Parmenio, and we are told to please the courtesan Thais, he burned the palaces of Persepolis to the ground and permitted his troops to loot the city. Then, having raised the spirits of his army with booty and gifts, he turned north to meet Darius for the last time. Darius had gathered, chiefly from his eastern provinces, a new army of 1,000,000 men: Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Syrians, Armenians, Cappadocians, Bactrians, Sogdians, Arachosians, Sasai, and Hindus, and had equipped them no longer with bows and arrows, but with javelins, spears, shields, horses, elephants, and scythe-wielding chariots intended to mow down the enemy like wheat. With this vast force, old Asia would make one more effort to preserve itself from adolescent Europe. Alexander, with 7,000 cavalry and 40,000 infantry, met the motley mob at Gaugamela, and by superior weapons, generalship, and courage destroyed it in a day. Darius again chose the better part of valor, but his generals, disgusted with this second flight, murdered him in his tent. Alexander put to death such of the assassins as he could find, sent the body of Darius in state to Persepolis, and ordered it to be buried in the manner of the Achaemenid kings. The Persian people flocked readily to the standard of the conqueror, charmed by his generosity and his youth. Alexander organized Persia into a province of the Macedonian Empire, left a strong garrison to guard it, and marched on to India.